In blue are all the democracies in the world, and gray are the ones that aren't. I think that the stat is it's roughly 2/3 countries in the world. There are roughly 185 countries in the world that have what's considered an electoral democracy. So visually, it kind of looks sort of 50-50, right? A few slides, just sort of a simplified look at how political economies emerge in the world. First, some people decide to have a democracy. Then they decide to create a system to govern themselves. The many decide who those few are. That's how our system works. We elect our leadership, and we hope that they vote and they make policy in our best interest. Another approach would be a few people decide that they can govern a people, and then they create a regime of the few to rule the many. So it's sort of flipped. Throughout history, we've seen many variations, each with different emphases of state and economy. So I made these little bubble diagrams that kind of show the range of political thought. Gray represents state, and blue represents the economy. They have formal names, going from the left from fascism, authoritarianism, socialism, democracy, to some idealized states on the right, libertarianism and anarchism. And the type of economies associated with them are also really important because they have different names. On the left, under fascism is corporatism, authoritarianism is planned economies. In modern times, it's sort of mixed. Socialism is mixed between state-owned and privately owned. In the United States, it is totally capitalist, but it is regulated. The government has a role in regulating it. If you are a libertarian, what you want is completely unregulated capitalism. And if you're an anarchist, what you want is called agorism. Anarchism basically thinks that all government is illegitimate, so there is no government. So it's completely wide open. So there is a spectrum. From the left, much more state presence. Going to the right, much more emphasis on the individual. And another way to look at it too is on the left, political systems that preference order through equality to total individual liberty. This slide I made, which is actually the first slide, I was looking for the slide on the web and I just sort of gave up and I decided that I actually needed to make a slide, which was a grid to kind of compare these various systems. And I'm not going to go through each one, but on the left, things like free speech, the right to assemble, religious freedom, free press, free elections, etc., healthcare, which you'll see very clearly that there are very profound differences with regards to freedom in these various systems. And what's also important is a lot of political systems are set up in either direct response or reaction to capitalism. Fascism and autocracies react against capitalism. They're really against class conflict, level the playing field, whereas in democracies and to a certain degree socialist systems, capitalism is reasonably okay. So I want to sort of compare three modern ones. There's China, the US, and Sweden. What comes out in a lot of these healthcare debates is a lot of fear around socialism. Specifically, my wife is sitting here. She's Canadian. I know a lot about that system, and it's not really that scary. The dotted lines represent some recent changes in these systems. So these systems aren't static. China is definitely, with a lot of their market reforms of the last 10 years, created an economy that is the fastest growing in the world right now. During our recession in the US, the government is growing. And because the nonprofit sector requires support from the private sector, during this recession, that's shrinking. And in Sweden, there is definitely a trend towards much more private ownership than strictly state ownership. But you look at this and you compare these things, with the rights and freedoms. Democracy and socialism, looks pretty good. I mean, the only no, in the U.S. is this universal health care, which they have in China. Some stats: China, only $6,000 per capita income. U.S. 47,000. Sweden, not that far away. The GDP of the United States, one of the strongest in the world, 13.8 trillion. China, 4.4 trillion. Sweden's a small country, 338 billion. But the thing to know is that the U.S. GDP has sort of stayed fairly stable for a long time, but the Chinese one is growing like crazy. China has a trade surplus, meaning that they export more than they import. The US has a gigantic trade deficit, and Sweden has a surplus. Transparency International does an index of corruption in the world. Sweden is the 4th least corrupt, China being the 57th least corrupt, and the US is surprisingly low on that spectrum. The Economist has this thing called the Democracy Index, where they measure a bunch of variables from free elections to free speech, etc. Sweden is considered number 1. Supposedly the best democracy in the world in the United States is not even the top 10. Poverty line, Sweden 0, US 12%, China 8%. This is based on the country's definition of poverty, which vary. So you have to wonder, what those definitions are. This is interesting. The Chinese Constitution, the Communist Constitution, mentions the word democracy 12 times. The US Constitution mentions it none. Guns in China, totally legal. The US, hell yes. Waiting period of 5 to 7 years in Sweden. Capital punishment in the US varies by state. Sweden is constitutionally forbidden. In China, they have mobile execution buses. So democracy and capitalism, is it something like a double helix? Do they, wind around each other? Is democracy voting and capitalism swiping your credit card? Is democracy buying in versus buying and selling? Is it mind share versus market share? On the right is a typical shareholder meeting for Walmart. Is it moral sentiment versus price sentiment? Is it an operating principle versus an operating system? What I've figured out is that democracy and capitalism, we both live within these two systems, but they're like two different rule books. In democracy, it's concerned with the two axes of equality and order. And in capitalism, it's really one axis, which is trying to satisfy your basic needs and survival. So if you're so lucky to be successful and wealthy, then it moves into a realm of about wealth, power, and status. It's one dimension versus two dimensions. And we are trapped in the intersection of these two systems, and it can be confusing. So democracy concerns itself with equality and order. So it applies some set theory. On the equality side, which I call tolerance issues, things like due process, civil rights, gender rights, race rights, and order is national defense, justice, the police, rule of law. And in the middle is where they intersect, which is the economic realm, which is about equality and order in terms of antitrust laws, financial regulation, contract enforcement, wealth redistribution, dealing with externalities like pollution, and social safety nets.